Hi, I'm Michael John Cusick at Restoring the Soul, and I'd like to welcome you to this exclusive conversation with Dr. Dan Allender. The subject is restoring sexual brokenness. We had this conversation about a week ago, and it won't be available to the public until late winter, maybe early spring, but it's available here at restoringthesoul.com/weekend only for people who sign up. Dr. Allender, of course, is an author, speaker, and psychologist. He's the author of over 20 books, including The Wounded Heart, Cry of the Soul, Bold Love, To Be Told, and his most recent book, Healing the Wounded Heart, which is a all-new book and updated helping guide for men and women who are recovering from or being restored from sexual abuse. It's also an awesome guide for helpers and counselors. We dig into that and so many other subjects, shame, misogyny, the harassment of women, and all that's been happening in the news lately, trauma, gender, what it means to be made in the image of God as male and female. And if you have heard Dan Allender before, I'm sure that you'll take away at least a nugget or two out of this. But more than that, I hope that this conversation encourages you wherever you are on your journey, whether you are a helper or caregiver, or whether you're just someone who wants to grow and thrive. So thanks again for tuning in. Dr. Dan Allender, thank you very much for making time to talk with me today. Welcome to the program.
A delight to be with you, Michael.
Our relationship goes back, I counted the years, 29 years since we first met in Akron, Ohio at one of your Wounded Heart conferences.
Wow.
And then 2 or 3 years later, I was gifted with studying with you and then training under you. So it's really, really good to be talking with you.
Well, thank you for aging us both.
Yeah, indeed. I'm sorry I missed you in Hollywood, and kudos to you for your work in the Heart of Man movie. I was part of the premiere there with a lot of the folks in it, and that was so fun. But your contribution to that was really significant, both in the formation of the movie and what you offered. What was that like for you to be part of it?
Well, it was sad to not be there. I had a Monday class that, the reality of having a day job can be very complicating. But
somebody has to do it, right?
Somebody has to teach. It was an honor. I mean, just an extraordinary honor. I think I was literally the first interview they did. So from that moment to the point of production, I just think the kind of labor that they endured to create the product that they did was staggering. The idea from the beginning was very compelling, but the number of iterations that they have gone through, I think, would be overwhelming for most people to hear. That was, I think, Jason told me later, it was about a 7-year project to create, and very few people will be that faithful over that length of time to create something that beautiful. So it was an immense honor to be part.
Yeah, I don't think Schindler's List took 7 years, but the fruit of it was pretty remarkable, and it's already going around the world and touching lives. And so that leads me to the topic of sexual brokenness. You've devoted over 40 years now as a minister, as a psychologist, and as a theologian to really working with, writing, and teaching about how people change and transformation. And at the end of our conversation, I want to get a little bit more into how you've evolved in your thinking to include inner healing and warfare and things like that. But would it be fair to say that most of your career has been around the area of sexual brokenness and the soul?
It has. I think that in one sense, the more particular way of putting it certainly has been sexual abuse. But I noted right from the beginning that evil seemed to delight in bringing about harm to our sense of what it means to be a man or a woman, and that nothing affects the human heart more than our sexuality. And so in that sense, sexuality has always been I think the primary means, not the exclusive, but the primary means that evil uses to distort, to damage, to in many ways degrade the nature of what it means to be made in the image of God. So if that's accurate, then sexual brokenness needs to be seen in the larger purview of what it means to engage God as human, to engage others as human. So in that, yes, absolutely, brokenness has been at the core.
And though you've worked with sexual abuse, especially in your practice and in your teaching, and in fact, the very first time I met you was at a sexual abuse seminar in,
Right.
1989, when I began to enter into my own story, and my life was forever changed by that. But you also talk about, because I've heard you say this dozens of times, that we're all sexually broken. You don't have to have experienced incest or molestation or other kind of sexual violations to be among the sexually broken.
No, I mean, let's just state it as bluntly as possible. Our sexuality is always deviant from what God intended. Now, how severe that struggle will be, there's always going to be an element to which our inner and outer world struggles with the reality of conformity to his righteousness. So if that's accurate, again, nothing touches the human heart. I mean, we know from research currently that, when sexual images of any sort are put before male or female, the brain lights up in a way that it lights up for nothing else. I mean, nothing else. It doesn't light up for winning the lottery. It doesn't light up for the return of your dearest friend that you haven't seen for years. Any level of excitement of the brain, nothing parallels the role of sexuality. And if that's the case, then it's back to that simple premise that our common struggle opens the door to a deeper conversations with one another.
So how do you respond to the man, and also I'm sure the woman, but probably more often men, who comes to you in your office or who you're just having a casual conversation with, and they say, well, what do you mean? I'm not sexually broken. I'm not addicted to porn. I haven't had affairs.
Well, if your comparison is another human being, you always have the opportunity for some form of decimation or some form of self-righteousness. I mean, you're in a, let's just, again, be very blunt. The bell-shaped curve pisses me off. It's true with regard to height, it's regard to intelligence, and in some ways, I think it's rather true with regard to even this whole concept of maturity. And most of us are pretty much in the middle and maybe one standard deviation above the norm. But that leaves a lot of people who are a lot lower, a lot higher than wherever we are. But we compare ourselves not to one another. We compare ourselves to Eden. We compare ourselves fundamentally to Jesus. And when that comparison's made, everyone shows a significant, realm for maturity.
Let's go back to the question of what exactly is sexuality, because I've always taught that sexuality is not about what set of genitals we have or what kind of chromosomes we're assigned, but rather this idea that you referred to about the image of God. Where right in Genesis 1:26 and 1:27, God says, let us, there's the plurality of the Trinity, right? Make man in our image, and then let us create them male and female. So there's something inherent to our sexuality that's deeper than genitality. Can you comment on that?
Well, yeah, I would agree with you so fully that, where we return to is the foundation of our very creation, and that God has pleasured himself to create difference, and difference that's vast, and not just vast male versus female, but vast within this whole realm of what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. And, in some ways, let me deviate from perhaps where you were going, but, we've got so many cultural, in many ways, suffocating points about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. From, women wear makeup in a particular way. Men don't wear makeup. And I'm not commending that men begin wearing makeup, but I also would press to say, even that category is so culturally constructed that what we conceive as male and female never gets fully defined in the scriptures. Never, in other words, we've got to do theological work that isn't culturally bound to do the work of determining what's the nature of what it means to be male and female. But whatever it means, he meant for there to be a difference. And that difference is meant to give a taste and fragrance to the complexity and richness of the God who created us in his image.
And so, remaining true to the biblical text, and yet in a pluralistic postmodern culture, how do you speak about maleness and femaleness and that vast difference?
Well, I think honestly, this is an arena of a lot of change, even in the last 5 years for me. Thinking in terms of how I might have named it, I probably would have felt that there was something about the nature of strength that was there with regard to maleness, and something of tenderness that was there with regard to femaleness. And I still hold that to be true, but I know so many men whose tenderness exceeds what many women tend to offer. And I certainly know strength in women that exceeds what often is found. So I would say both are meant, strength and tenderness are meant to be part of both of who we are as male, as female. So in that sense, I would go back to the category that there is one core uniqueness, and that is women give birth, men don't, which means that there is, again, a difficult beginning category is to say women are more like God. Women are more like God in they have the capacity to create in a way that a man cannot, and that is to create from the very, literally, sinews, right from the cellular standpoint of their being, which is why I think there is so much misogyny, so much, and again, to say the word hatred of women is not untrue, but what I would say is envy of women, envy of the intimacy, envy of the creative power and the imagination and the tenderness, so that when we begin to name that a woman for, good Lord, for millennia have been abused in the way that we're seeing currently in the hashtag Me Too, the Weinstein, and that you start looking at almost this long history of powerful men, the idea that women are far more susceptible to abuse. And I don't think that can be simply called lust. I think that has to be seen as more violent than just desire gone mad. It is desire gone mad with a vengeance against. And that's been part of my work over many, many, many decades is again, just to ponder why is there such misuse of women? Far more than there is so-called misuse of men.
You're so I'm so glad you brought this up, because especially in today's culture where every day we're reading in the news about another man or another handful of men dropping like flies. And of course, my story is one of sexual exploitation of women and sexual harassment of women. And the antidote is really humility and stepping into and through shame, which I definitely want to talk about. But so many men, since we're talking about the misuse of women and misogyny, don't know what to do about that. And at best, oftentimes in the Christian community, we use euphemisms like working on your purity, or someone had a moral failure, which of course can be not serving the poor is a moral failure. But
yes.
But how do we step beyond, quote, working on purity, and step into our stories and our brokenness in a way where not only we would be transformed and restored, but that would be part of the restoration of the world and the kingdom come?
Well, it's a beautiful question, and the question itself is so indicative of the nature of the work that you do with people. And that is the assumption that there is more to our struggle than the fact that we struggle with lust. And again, I've tried to say that I think lust is desire gone mad. It's a kind of consumption, a rage to fill that core emptiness that exists within all of us. I never want that to be minimized. That's always a factor in our exploitation, not just of women, but our exploitation of ourselves, our exploitation of the earth. I mean, all forms of misuse rather than honor. So if we contrast misuse, violation to the word honor, why are we dishonoring ourselves, others, the earth, and ultimately God? Well, I always come back to the second category of anger. So Jesus talks about sin in the category of lust and anger. What's the anger involved in pornography? Well, it's the joy of degradation. And that is we're, at least as a culture, closer to being able to acknowledge the powerful role of lust. But we're still deeply reluctant to face that there is a part of us that wants to make someone pay. So in that sense, to make a shift that will feel too severe for most people, but to say, no, I mean, for a man to face the way he misuses women requires him to deal with his first woman. And that's not your first date. It's not your first sexual encounter. It's your mother. So when we open the door to the complexity, particularly of a boy with his mother, that, the pushback I get to this day is like, don't you mess with my mother. You can look at war films and see men dying on the battlefield. Seldom, and maybe never, do they cry out for their fathers. And so the relationship we have with our mother is intimate, it's complex, and it's highly, oh my God, highly defended. So to begin that process to say, no, every man engaging pornography is to some degree, and again, that's back to the bell-shaped curve, to some degree, some way less, some way more, but everyone on that continuum is addressing something with regard to their mother. And so that warfare, that war of what will I do with the younger parts of me that feel embedded, feel in many ways enmeshed, or feel lost and abandoned with regard to my relationship with my mother, that becomes the place where you begin with misogyny in the first core relationship, and that's mother-son.
Yeah. Wow. There's so many questions and directions I could go with that, but the first thing that comes to my mind is that why in the world would we begin to face that unless there is a good and merciful God that's better than we even imagine, with whom we can come before and say, I misuse women, or I have been misused by a man or another woman, and I can bring the very worst of who I am, my shame, even this joy in degrading others, which is a brutal, brutal truth to admit, right? But that's the paradox of Christianity in the heart of God, is that when we face the ugliness, we see who we really are, and we see who God really is.
Well, again, I don't carry a gun. I don't own a gun
anymore, right?
Well, anymore. But somebody cut me off on the road the other day, and I sort of put my face up against my window and mouthed words that if it had been, if it had been captured by an iPhone, something of my current work would be highly questioned. And I'm going, what in the name of God is going on? Like, you got inconvenienced for 3 seconds, and you're willing to virtually risk your reputation and your presence in the kingdom of God for what? And in some ways, that level of I wanted that particular car and driver to pay, and it wasn't just for the insult or for the mere small threat that they posed by cutting me off. In some ways, it was the voluminous rage I've not addressed over scores of smaller, bigger insults. Just again, go back to one core category. We all know we're angry. How angry, and particularly white males angry. And so when you begin to frame that and to say, let's take the awareness of what Scripture says and what we know about ourselves into the realm of exploitation of women, it becomes a very, as you put it brilliantly, humbling. But again, shame divides, but eventually shame exasperates to a point where you literally have such a deeply divided inner and outer world. Then I think that sense of you are far from whom you were meant to be and who you were most meant to be with. I think in some ways shame is what drives us back to God.